The little black girl warned the biker someone dragged a child toward a hidden pit behind the hunting camp. Hello everyone. Before we begin today's story, I have a small favor to ask. Please hit subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you never miss our channel's new videos. It's quick, free, and the best way to support us in bringing you more dramatic stories. Your support means the world to us. Where are you watching from? Drop your city or country in the comments below. Thank you very much. Now, let's get into today's story. It was late in the evening, the sun had set, and the air around the hunting camp was still warm from the summer heat. The distant hum of cicadas filled the air as a group of bikers gathered around a campfire, sharing stories and laughs. Among them, Jack Storm Daniels, the president of the Thunder Riders Motorcycle Club, sat quietly, cleaning his bike. He was a man of few words, but there was a deep sense of loyalty in his eyes that could be felt by anyone who truly knew him. His club, known for their rough exterior and their commitment to their brothers and sisters, was more than just a group of bikers. They were a family. As Jack wiped down his bike, his thoughts were interrupted by a sudden sound, a small voice calling out from the shadows of the woods surrounding the camp. He stood up, his sharp eyes scanning the darkness, instinctively reaching for the hand grip of his leather jacket. A small figure emerged from the trees, running toward him. A little black girl, no more than 8 or 9 years old, her face streaked with dirt and tears. She was barefoot, her feet covered in cuts, her dress torn. Her eyes were wide with terror, and her small body was shaking with fear. "Please, help," she cried, her voice barely audible over the sound of the wind rustling through the trees. "They took my brother. They're taking him to the pit." Jack's heart sank as he stepped forward, his protective instincts kicking in. Without a second thought, he knelt down in front of the girl, his hands gentle but firm on her shoulders. "Who took him, kid? Tell me everything," he said, his voice calm but commanding. The little girl, gasping for air between sobs, pointed toward the dark expanse of trees. "A man, a bad man. He dragged Jamal into the woods, toward the pit behind the camp. Please, you have to stop them." Her words came out in a frantic rush, as though the very act of speaking was draining her of what little strength she had left. Jack's mind raced as he processed her words. The pit. He had heard rumors about an old, abandoned mine behind the camp. It had been there for years, long before the hunting club had even set up shop. No one knew exactly what it was used for, but the idea of a pit filled him with dread. He couldn't let this child's brother suffer the same fate as the rumors spoke of. Without hesitation, Jack turned to his club. "We ride now. There's a kid in danger, and I'm not about to let him disappear into that hellhole." His words hit the group like a shot of adrenaline. In an instant, the sound of engines roaring to life filled the air. The Thunder Riders were on the move. The girl clung to Jack's leather vest as they all mounted their bikes, her tiny body trembling in his arms. "Stay with me, kid," Jack said softly, his voice a steady presence amidst the chaos. "We're gonna get him back." The bikers raced toward the dark woods, the roar of their engines a loud defiance against the silence of the night. Each rider, focused and determined, knew that this wasn't just a rescue mission. This was personal. They were fighting for something more than just a child. They were fighting for their family. As they neared the woods, the distant glow of the campfire faded, and the air grew colder. The group slowed down, their bikes cutting through the darkness, their headlights illuminating the narrow trail ahead. Jack's mind was already planning their next move, the tension thick in the air. He couldn't afford to waste time. Every second counted. "Stay sharp, everyone," he called over the radio. "The pit's not far, and I have a feeling we're not the only ones out here tonight." The night was thick with tension as Jack and the Thunder Riders roared through the woods, the sounds of their engines cutting through the otherwise quiet night. The little girl, still clinging to Jack's leather vest, trembled against the rush of wind, her eyes darting nervously. As the darkness seemed to close in around them, Jack could feel the weight of responsibility pressing down on him with every mile they covered. The girl's brother, Jamal, was out there, somewhere in the woods, and they were running out of time. As they neared the edge of the forest, Jack gave a quick glance over his shoulder to make sure the club was still with him. Every rider was tight in formation, their bikes humming in perfect sync as they navigated the winding trail. The trees were thick, their branches swaying in the night wind, and the moonlight barely cut through the canopy, leaving them in near-complete darkness. Jack's thoughts raced. He had known something wasn't right when the girl came running toward them, but the reality of the situation was starting to settle in. The pit. The rumors he'd heard about it over the years seemed to have been true. He could feel the hair on the back of his neck stand up as the thought of what might be happening to that little boy filled him with dread. The headlights of their bikes illuminated a small clearing ahead, and Jack slowed his bike, signaling for the group to do the same. The engines rumbled to a low hum as they came to a stop, the headlights casting long shadows across the forest floor. The girl, still gripping Jack's vest, pointed a shaking finger toward a small hill in the distance, barely visible in the dim light. "It's over there," she whispered. Jack's heart pounded in his chest as he looked toward the hill. It wasn't much to go on, but it was the only lead they had. Without another word, Jack revved his bike and began to move forward, his crew falling in line behind him. The clearing was silent now, save for the crunch of gravel under their tires and the occasional snap of a branch as they moved forward. As they approached the hill, Jack's mind sharpened. Every part of him was on high alert. The moment they entered the woods, he knew they were no longer just dealing with a missing child. They were walking into something far darker. They reached the hill, and Jack motioned for the group to dismount. The ground beneath them was soft and damp, and the scent of decay filled the air. It wasn't just the forest, it was something worse. Jack felt a deep unease settle in his gut. The girl's hand tightened around his arm as she tugged him toward a narrow path that led deeper into the trees. "This way," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. Jack followed her lead, his eyes scanning every shadow. The sound of footsteps echoed in the distance, and his grip on the handlebars tightened. The air felt thicker now, heavier, as if the forest itself was holding its breath. Jack signaled for the club to follow him. They moved in silence, the only sound the crunch of their boots on the forest floor. As they turned a bend in the path, a faint glow appeared in the distance. It was a weak, flickering light that seemed out of place in the middle of the woods. Jack's heart skipped a beat. "That's it," he muttered under his breath. "That's the pit." They moved closer, the glow growing brighter with each step. As they approached, the ground sloped downward, and Jack saw a small clearing ahead, illuminated by a flickering fire. At the center of the clearing, a figure stood over a pit, his back turned to them. Jack's blood ran cold as he recognized the man. It was the same figure the girl had described. The man was tall, broad-shouldered, and wearing a dark jacket, his face obscured by the shadows of the night. He was holding something in his hand, Jamal. The boy was limp in his arms, his head hanging low. Jack's breath caught in his throat. "No." The word was a growl, a guttural sound that came from deep within his chest. The man's head snapped up at the sound, and his eyes locked onto Jack's. For a split second, there was nothing but silence. Then the man moved, pushing Jamal toward the edge of the pit. Jack's body reacted before his mind could catch up. He lunged forward, his hand outstretched. "Let him go." The command rang through the air like a shot. The man sneered, a twisted grin spreading across his face. He had no intention of backing down. "You think you can stop me, old man?" he spat. The tension in the air was thick with danger, and Jack felt every muscle in his body coil with readiness. His voice was calm, but the anger behind it was undeniable. "I'm not leaving here without that kid." The man laughed, the sound low and menacing. "Then you're in for a fight." Without warning, he shoved Jamal forward, sending him tumbling toward the edge of the pit. Jack's heart stopped. In that moment, everything seemed to move in slow motion. The girl screamed, her voice piercing the night. But Jack didn't hesitate. He sprinted toward the pit, his body moving on pure instinct. The world around him blurred, and all he could focus on was getting to Jamal before it was too late. The world seemed to slow down as Jack lunged forward, his eyes locked on Jamal as the boy tumbled helplessly toward the edge of the pit. The ground beneath him was uneven, the dirt loose, and for a moment, Jack feared that the boy would slip and fall into the darkness below. He couldn't let that happen. His legs burned with the effort as he pushed himself harder, the sound of his boots thumping against the forest floor. His heart raced, pounding in his chest, but his mind remained focused. Every step he took was fueled by one thought: save the kid. The edge of the pit was just ahead. Jack could see Jamal's small body, the boy's arms flailing as he tried to regain balance. The man who had dragged him here, still standing by the edge of the pit, turned his attention back to Jack, a cruel smile spreading across his face. "You think you can save him?" the man taunted. His voice was cold, mocking, as though he knew Jack was too late. Jack's muscles tensed as he reached the edge of the pit, barely able to stop himself from sliding over it. With a swift move, he grabbed Jamal just in time, pulling the boy back from the brink. The little one let out a strangled cry, his tiny hands clutching at Jack's arm in desperation. "Please," the boy whimpered. "Please don't let me fall." Jack didn't say a word. He just pulled him in close, holding the boy tight, as if he was his own son. There was no time to waste. The biker club was just behind him, but they needed to act fast. The man, furious now, reached for something in his pocket, a knife, glinting dangerously in the dim light. Jack's eyes locked onto it, and without thinking, he pulled Jamal behind him, stepping forward to face the threat head-on. "Stay back," Jack growled, his voice low and steady. The man smirked, clearly not intimidated. "You're too late," he sneered, his hand tightening around the handle of the knife. The tension in the air was thick, but Jack knew one thing. He wouldn't let anyone harm this child. As the man lunged toward him, Jack acted on pure instinct, grabbing the nearest rock and hurling it toward him. It struck the man's arm, knocking the knife out of his hand. The man cursed and stumbled back, but Jack didn't hesitate. He grabbed the man by the collar of his jacket and shoved him against the side of the pit, pinning him there with all his strength. "You're done," Jack hissed, his voice a deadly promise. The man struggled, trying to break free, but Jack was too strong, too determined. Behind him, the bikers arrived, their motorcycles roaring to a halt, their boots crunching in the dirt as they dismounted. They surrounded the man, their eyes hard and unwavering. "What's the plan, boss?" one of the bikers called, his voice low but steady. Jack didn't look back. His focus remained on the man in front of him, his grip tightening. "We get him out of here," Jack said, his voice firm. "This kid's going home." The bikers didn't need another word. One by one, they moved in, securing the man and making sure he wouldn't escape. The girl, who had been standing off to the side, finally stepped forward, her eyes wide with a mixture of relief and fear. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice trembling. Jack nodded, his heart heavy with the weight of what had almost happened. But they weren't done yet. There was still more to do. "We're not finished," Jack said, turning to the bikers. "Get the kid back to the camp. I'll deal with him." He pointed to the man, who was still struggling against the club members holding him down. "The rest of you, stay on alert. We don't know if there's more where this came from." The bikers nodded, moving into action. They had a job to do, and they weren't about to let anyone hurt this child again. Jack turned back to Jamal, who was still clinging to him, his face pale and tear-streaked. Jack's heart ached for the boy. "You're safe now," Jack said softly, pulling him close. The boy nodded, but there was still fear in his eyes. Jack could see the trauma in those eyes, the scars that no child should ever have to bear. "It's over," Jack said, more to reassure himself than the boy. He led him back toward the camp, where the other bikers were already preparing to leave. The journey back would be long, but Jack didn't care. He was determined to get Jamal to safety, no matter the cost. As they reached the bikes, the rest of the club gathered around, their faces grim but resolute. "Let's go," Jack said, lifting Jamal onto his bike. "We've got a kid to protect." The engines roared to life once again as they began their ride back, the camp growing smaller in the distance behind them. The night was far from over, but for now, they had done what they came to do, save a child from a fate worse than death. The ride back was intense, the engines of the Thunder Riders roaring as they cut through the darkness of the night. Jack could feel Jamal's small form pressed tightly against him, the boy still shaken by everything that had happened. The cool air of the night did little to ease the tension building in Jack's chest. His mind was consumed with the events of the past few hours, but he couldn't shake the image of the boy's wide, terrified eyes as they watched the man drag him toward the pit. The journey back to the camp felt longer than it should have, the trail winding through dense woods and empty roads. Jack kept his focus ahead, his grip steady on the handlebars, but his thoughts kept wandering back to the boy and his sister. The girl's gratitude had been overwhelming, but Jack knew that this wasn't the end. There was still so much to do. He glanced over his shoulder, checking on the rest of the bikers. They were still in perfect formation, every rider keeping a sharp eye on the surroundings. Even though the immediate danger had passed, Jack knew better than to let his guard down. They weren't safe yet. As they neared the edge of the woods, the headlights of the bikes lit up the road ahead, casting long shadows across the pavement. Jack could see the faint outline of the camp up ahead, the lights from the cabins flickering in the distance. The sense of relief was almost palpable, but Jack didn't feel it. Not yet. They had to make sure the kids were safe, and the man was dealt with. The rest of the club followed closely behind, their expressions hard and determined. They had all seen what happened, and they knew that this situation wasn't over. As they reached the camp, Jack slowed his bike and pulled to a stop. The others followed, dismounting and gathering around him. He could feel the weight of their stares, the unspoken questions hanging in the air. They were waiting for orders, and Jack knew exactly what he had to do. He turned to the group, his voice low but firm. "We need to make sure those kids are taken care of," he said. "I don't care what it takes, but we get them to safety." One of the bikers, Diesel, nodded grimly. "We'll make sure they're okay, boss," he said, his voice steady. "You don't need to worry about that." Jack's eyes shifted to the camp, where the little girl and her brother had already been taken inside. They would be safe for now, but the man they had just faced was still out there, and Jack wasn't going to let him get away. He turned back to the group, his expression hardening. "We need to make sure we find out who else is involved in this. That pit wasn't just for show. There's something bigger going on here." The bikers nodded in agreement. They all knew what that meant. There were people out there who were using children as pawns in their twisted games, and Jack wasn't going to rest until they were all brought to justice. As the bikers began to regroup, Jack took a deep breath, letting the weight of the situation settle in. He knew that the road ahead wouldn't be easy. They had to protect the kids, bring down the men behind this, and make sure no one else would ever have to face the horrors they had just witnessed. It would take everything they had, but Jack was ready. His loyalty to his brothers and sisters was unshakable, and he would fight to the end to keep them safe. But for now, they needed to rest. The journey back had been long, and even though the battle wasn't over, they had earned this moment of peace. The night was still young, and the camp was quiet, but Jack knew that tomorrow would bring more challenges. As he walked toward the cabin, he glanced up at the stars. They were bright tonight, the sky clear and vast above him. It was a rare moment of calm, and Jack savored it. But his thoughts were still on Jamal and his sister. He knew that their lives would never be the same after tonight. They had been through something unimaginable, something no child should ever have to experience. And he had made them a promise that he would keep. "We're not done yet," Jack whispered to himself as he stepped inside the cabin, his hand resting on the doorframe. Not by a long shot. The night seemed to stretch on forever, but Jack was ready for whatever came next. He would make sure those kids were safe, and he would make sure the men who did this would pay. His brotherhood, his family, would stand together, no matter what. And together, they would make things right. The next morning, the camp was quieter than usual. The sun had just risen, casting a warm golden hue over the landscape, but the weight of the previous night still hung in the air. Jack stood outside the cabin, his eyes scanning the horizon, lost in thought. The calm of the morning felt like an illusion, a brief moment of peace before the storm. His mind was still on the kids, Jamal and his sister. They were safe now, but that didn't mean they were out of danger. Jack had a feeling that last night's events were just the beginning. As the rest of the Thunder Riders gathered around the campfire, preparing for the day, Jack knew they had a mission ahead of them. The man they had encountered in the woods, the one who had dragged Jamal toward the pit, wasn't working alone. There was something much bigger at play here. He had seen the way the man had acted, the sense of entitlement and coldness in his eyes. This wasn't just a random act of cruelty. It was part of something much darker. "We need to find out who else is behind this," Jack said as he approached his brothers, his voice steady but filled with resolve. Diesel, his right-hand man, looked up from the fire, his face grim. "You think it's a bigger operation?" he asked. Jack nodded. "Yeah, there's a network, and we need to get to the bottom of it before more kids end up like Jamal." The bikers exchanged looks, each one understanding the gravity of the situation. They had ridden across the country for years, facing their fair share of trouble, but this felt different. This was about more than just their brotherhood. It was about protecting those who couldn't protect themselves. "What's the plan?" Diesel asked, already preparing himself for action. Jack paused, taking in a deep breath before responding. "We need to split up. We'll gather intel, find out who's involved, and make sure the kids are taken care of. This isn't something we can do alone. We'll need some help." He turned to his club members. "Phantom, you and Crow head into town. Find out if anyone has seen anything suspicious. We need to know if there are more victims out there." Crow nodded, her expression hardening. "We'll do what we can," she said. Jack turned to the others. "Vince, take a few of the guys and check the woods behind the camp. Make sure no one's hiding out there. We don't know if the guy we captured last night was alone." Vince gave a small nod. "On it." Jack's eyes lingered on the horizon for a moment before he turned back to the group. "I'm going to make some calls. If we're going to take these guys down, we need to know who we're up against." As the bikers set off on their separate tasks, Jack felt a deep sense of unease. He had promised to keep these kids safe, and he intended to do whatever it took to make good on that promise. The camp may have seemed quiet now, but Jack knew it wouldn't last. The calm was only temporary, and the storm that was coming would test them all. He couldn't shake the image of Jamal's terrified face as they had pulled him back from the pit. That kid had seen things no child should ever have to witness, and Jack was determined to make sure that no other child ever had to go through the same thing. Jack reached for his phone and dialed a number. As the phone rang, he thought about the choices ahead of him. There was no turning back now. They were in this, and they were going to see it through to the end. When the call connected, Jack's voice was calm but firm. "It's Jack. We need help. I'm sending some of my people to you. It's bigger than we thought. Get ready." He ended the call and turned back to the camp, where the bikers were preparing for the next phase of their mission. Jamal and his sister were safe for now, but there was still work to be done. Jack looked up at the sky, his gaze hardening. He knew this wasn't going to be easy, but he also knew that they couldn't afford to fail. This was their family, and they would protect it at all costs. As the bikers revved their engines and prepared to leave, Jack felt the weight of the responsibility on his shoulders. But he wasn't afraid. He had made a promise, and he intended to keep it. The air was thick with tension as Jack stood at the edge of the camp, watching the bikers disperse to complete their assigned tasks. His mind was focused, sharp, but the events of the night still haunted him. Jamal and his sister had been saved, but Jack knew this was far from over. The deeper they dug, the darker the web of corruption seemed to grow. The pit, the man they had confronted in the woods, and the way the girl had described the events, it all pointed to something much larger than just a few rogue criminals. There was a system at work, and Jack intended to take it down. As he looked out across the camp, the rest of the Thunder Riders were already preparing for the next phase of their mission. Diesel and Crow had gone into town to gather information, and Vince had taken a team to search the surrounding woods for any additional threats. Jack had made some calls and was waiting for the response. The only way they would get through this was by working together, using every resource they had. Jack felt a hand on his shoulder, pulling him from his thoughts. He turned to find Bear, one of his most trusted bikers, standing beside him. Bear's face was grim, his eyes dark with concern. "We've got a problem," Bear said, his voice low. Jack raised an eyebrow. "What's going on?" "We found something," Bear continued, his voice steady. "It's about the pit. We need to talk." Jack motioned for Bear to lead the way, and they walked over to the far side of the camp where the rest of the club was gathered. Bear pulled out a crumpled map from his jacket and spread it on the table. "We checked out the area around the pit. There's more than just a hole in the ground." He pointed to a spot on the map. "We found an old shack nearby. It's hidden deep in the woods, away from the main trail. We think it's being used as a base of operations." Jack's heart sank. This was worse than he thought. He leaned over the map, studying it carefully. "What else did you find?" Bear's eyes narrowed. "There are tracks leading to and from the shack. Looks like people have been coming and going, but they're covering their tracks. We couldn't get too close. Whoever's using it knows how to stay hidden." Jack ran a hand through his hair, his mind racing. "So what's the plan?" Bear glanced up at him. "We go in. We find out what they're hiding. If we're lucky, we'll get the evidence we need to shut this down for good." Jack nodded. "Get the crew together. We leave in 10 minutes." Bear left to organize the riders, and Jack took a moment to gather his thoughts. They had no idea what they would find in that shack, but they couldn't afford to waste any time. The clock was ticking, and the man they had confronted in the woods wasn't going to stop until he got what he wanted. As Jack prepared to head out, he noticed Jamal and his sister standing near the campfire, talking to one of the club members. The girl looked a little calmer now, though her eyes still held the fear of what had happened. Jack approached them, his voice gentle. "Hey, how are you doing?" The girl looked up at him, her face still pale, but her eyes full of gratitude. "I'm okay," she said quietly. "I can't believe it's over." Jack gave her a reassuring smile. "It's not over yet. We still have some work to do. But you're safe now." Jamal, who had been silent up until now, looked up at Jack. "Are we going to be okay?" he asked, his voice small and uncertain. Jack's heart ached for the boy. "Yes, you're going to be okay. I promise you that." The girl's eyes filled with tears as she looked up at Jack. "Thank you," she whispered. "I don't know what we would have done without you." Jack nodded, his expression softening. "You don't have to thank me. I'm just doing what needs to be done." He paused for a moment before turning to the rest of the club. "Let's get moving. We have a shack to find." As the bikers revved their engines and began to prepare for the next leg of their mission, Jack couldn't help but feel the weight of responsibility on his shoulders. He had made a promise to keep these kids safe, and he wasn't going to let anything stop him from fulfilling that promise. The road ahead was uncertain, but Jack knew one thing for sure. They were going to take down whoever was behind this and make sure no one else suffered like Jamal and his sister had. They had been through too much already, and Jack wasn't about to let their pain go unanswered. The Thunder Riders rode out, their engines roaring to life as they sped down the road toward the woods. The mission was far from over, but Jack was ready. They were in this together, and nothing would stop them from making sure justice was served. The forest was dense and silent as the Thunder Riders rode deeper into the woods, their headlights slicing through the darkness. Jack led the way, his mind focused on the mission ahead. They had tracked the location of the shack, and now it was time to find out what secrets it held. The air was thick with the smell of pine and damp earth, the only sound the steady rumble of the engines and the occasional rustle of leaves beneath their tires. Jack's thoughts were racing, but he kept his eyes on the trail ahead. He knew that this was their best shot at uncovering the truth about the operation behind the pit. He had seen the fear in the kids' eyes, and he wasn't going to let them down. As they approached the outskirts of the woods, the trees began to thin, revealing a clearing up ahead. In the center of the clearing stood the shack, its weathered wood barely visible in the dim light. It looked abandoned, but Jack knew better than to assume it was empty. The fact that they had been able to track the location so easily meant someone was still using it. He signaled to the group to slow down, and the bikers fell into a tight formation, their engines humming softly as they moved toward the shack. Jack motioned for Bear and Diesel to move ahead, their eyes scanning the area for any signs of activity. The rest of the crew stayed close, ready for whatever they might find. Jack's heart raced as they approached the shack. He had seen a lot in his time, but something about this place felt different. It was like a shadow hanging over them, a sense of danger that he couldn't shake. As Bear and Diesel moved to the side of the shack, Jack took a deep breath and stepped forward, his boots crunching softly on the ground. He reached for the door of the shack, but before he could open it, a sound from inside made him freeze. The unmistakable sound of movement. Someone was inside. Jack's mind went into overdrive as he signaled for the others to spread out. The tension in the air was palpable, the quiet only broken by the sound of their breath and the distant rustling of the trees. They had to be careful. They couldn't afford to make a mistake now. Jack reached for his radio and whispered, "Stay alert. We move in on my signal." The bikers nodded, their expressions hard and focused. Jack slowly reached for the door again, this time pushing it open with a creak that sounded deafening in the silence. The interior of the shack was dark, the only light coming from a small crack in the ceiling. Jack's eyes scanned the room, his body tense as he took in the scene. The shack was empty, but it didn't feel like it. There were signs of recent activity, scraps of food, a pile of dirty clothes, and a makeshift bed in the corner. And then, Jack saw it. On the far side of the room, there was a small wooden table covered with papers. He stepped closer, his boots silent on the creaky floorboards, and picked up one of the papers. His heart sank as he read the words. It was a list of names. Children, all of them marked with dates. Jack's mind raced as he realized what this was. This wasn't just a random kidnapping. This was an organized operation, and these children were being targeted, taken, and likely sold. He turned to Bear, his voice low but filled with urgency. "We need to move, now? This goes deeper than we thought." Bear nodded, his face grim. "What's the plan?" Jack didn't hesitate. "We get the kids out, and we bring this whole thing down." He turned to the rest of the crew. We need to find out who's behind this. No more waiting. As the bikers began to gather the evidence, Jack's mind raced with the possibilities. The names on the list, the pit, the shack, it was all connected. But who was pulling the strings? And how far did this operation reach? He knew they couldn't take it all on themselves. They needed backup, and they needed it fast. Vince, Jack said, turning to his trusted lieutenant. Get on the radio. We need to contact the authorities. This is bigger than us. Vince nodded and moved toward his bike, pulling out the radio. The rest of the crew kept their focus on the shack, gathering everything they could find. Jack's heart was still racing, but now there was a glimmer of hope. They had the evidence, and they had the momentum. This was the breakthrough they needed. As the group gathered around Jack, he took a deep breath. We've got a long road ahead, but this is just the beginning. We bring them down, no matter what it takes. The bikers nodded, their resolve unwavering. They had been through battles before, but this was different. This wasn't just about fighting for themselves. It was about protecting those who couldn't protect themselves. They had already saved Jamal and his sister, but now they had a larger mission: to stop the network of people who were exploiting innocent children. The sun was beginning to set as the group mounted their bikes, ready to head back. Jack looked over at the shack one last time, the weight of the task ahead pressing on him. But he wasn't afraid. They were in this together, and they would see it through to the end. The ride back to the camp was a blur. The engine roared beneath Jack as he led the group of bikers through the winding forest path. Their mission was now clear. There was no turning back. The list they had found in the shack, the evidence of a network exploiting children, had set a fire in Jack's chest. He couldn't let these people go free. He wouldn't. As the group neared the camp, Jack's thoughts raced. The bikers had gathered the evidence they needed, but now they had to find a way to take down the people behind this. Jack's mind was already turning over strategies. He knew they couldn't do it alone. They needed to call in the authorities, but they had to be careful. The people behind this were powerful, and they weren't going to let anyone get in their way. Jack signaled to the rest of the group as they arrived at the camp. The air was thick with tension, but there was a sense of urgency in every biker's eyes. They all knew the job wasn't done. Diesel pulled up beside Jack, his face grim. "We've got a problem," Diesel said, his voice low. Jack raised an eyebrow. "What's going on?" Diesel hesitated for a moment, then spoke. "It's about the names on the list. We've been going through them, and some of them are high up in the community. Politicians, business owners, law enforcement." Jack's heart skipped a beat. "You're saying this goes all the way to the top?" Diesel nodded, his expression hard. "Yeah, we're not dealing with a few low-level criminals. This is bigger than we thought." Jack clenched his fists, his jaw tightening. He knew this wasn't going to be easy, but he wasn't about to back down. "We have to stop them," Jack said, his voice steady but filled with determination. "We'll bring them down, no matter who they are." He turned to the rest of the group. "We're not done yet. We've got a target on our backs now, but we're not going to stop until we bring these bastards to justice." The bikers nodded, their expressions resolute. They knew what they had to do. "What's the plan, boss?" Diesel asked. Jack looked around at the group, his eyes hardening with focus. "We need to get the authorities involved, but we can't trust just anyone. We'll need a contact we can rely on. Someone who can help us take this to the next level." He paused for a moment, then continued. "We'll split up. Half of us will keep an eye on the camp and make sure no one tries anything while the other half heads into town to meet with our contact. We can't waste any more time." The bikers wasted no time in getting to work. Jack's mind was already calculating the next steps. They needed to move quickly, but they couldn't afford to be reckless. The man they had confronted in the woods, the one who had dragged Jamal toward the pit, was just the tip of the iceberg. Jack knew they had to take down the entire network, and that meant going after the people at the top. As Jack prepared to head into town to meet with their contact, he looked back at the camp. The kids were safe for now, but he couldn't help but feel a deep sense of responsibility for them. He had made them a promise, and he wasn't going to rest until he fulfilled it. The bikers had already begun to move, and Jack could see the determination in their eyes. They had faced down enemies before, but this was different. This wasn't just a fight for survival. This was a fight for justice, for the innocent lives that had been shattered by the people they were going after. As Jack rode into town, the weight of the task ahead settled on his shoulders. But he wasn't afraid. He had made his choice, and there was no going back now. The rest of the group followed close behind, and together, they would take down the people responsible for the horrors they had uncovered. The road ahead was uncertain, but Jack was ready for whatever came next. The Thunder Riders had always been a family, and they were going to stand together, no matter what. The sun had barely risen when Jack and the Thunder Riders arrived in town. The quiet streets felt strangely calm, a stark contrast to the chaos that had been brewing in the woods. The mission was clear now. They had to take down the entire network that had been exploiting innocent children, and that meant working with someone they could trust, someone who could help them bring this to the authorities without anyone getting tipped off. Jack's eyes scanned the small town as they pulled into a parking lot, the sound of their engines loud against the otherwise peaceful morning. He could feel the weight of the mission pressing on him. Every minute counted, and they were close, but there was no room for error. As the bikers dismounted, Diesel stepped up to Jack, his face hard with determination. "We've got to move quickly," Diesel said, his voice low. "The contact's waiting for us." Jack nodded, feeling the tension in the air. They had come this far, but the people they were up against were powerful, and they wouldn't hesitate to destroy anyone who got in their way. "Stay sharp," Jack said to the crew. "We don't know who we can trust here. We stick together." The group moved toward the diner where their contact was waiting, the small bell above the door jingling as they entered. The smell of fresh coffee and pancakes filled the air, but Jack couldn't shake the sense of danger. They were being watched. Jack's eyes flicked to the back of the diner, where a man sat alone at a booth, his face partially hidden by a newspaper. He looked up as they approached, his expression unreadable. "You're late," the man said, his voice gruff but calm. Jack nodded, sitting down across from him. "We've been busy," Jack replied, his gaze steady. The man folded the newspaper and set it aside. "I've got the information you need, but it's going to cost you," he said, his eyes narrowing. Jack didn't flinch. "How much?" he asked. The man leaned in, lowering his voice. "It's not about money. It's about trust. You want to take these people down, you need to make sure you're not walking into a trap." Jack leaned forward, his fists clenched. "We're ready. We've already gathered the evidence." The man nodded. "I know, but what you're up against is bigger than you think. These people have eyes everywhere, and they've been in control for years. You won't take them down just by exposing their names." Jack's jaw tightened. "Then what do we need to do?" The man looked around the diner, making sure no one was listening, before speaking again. "You need to go after the money. It's always about the money. These people have deep pockets, and their influence reaches further than you can imagine. If you can hit them where it hurts, you'll cripple them." Jack nodded, his mind racing. He had known the operation was large, but hearing it laid out like this made it all the more real. This wasn't just a group of criminals. They were a well-oiled machine, and if they were going to stop them, they would need to hit hard. "We'll need a way in," Jack said, his voice steady. The man slid a piece of paper across the table. "This is the address of one of their front businesses. It's a cover, but it's also where the money flows. I suggest you hit it fast, before they can cover their tracks." Jack grabbed the paper, his mind already calculating the next steps. "We'll be ready," he said, standing up. "One more thing," the man said as Jack turned to leave. Jack paused and looked back. "What's that?" The man's eyes darkened. "You don't know who you're dealing with. These people don't lose. Be careful." With that, Jack nodded, turning to the bikers. As they filed out of the diner and back onto their bikes, Jack could feel the tension building again. The plan was set, but the stakes had just been raised. They weren't just going up against petty criminals anymore. They were up against an empire, and if they were going to bring it down, they had to be smarter than ever before. The sound of the engines roaring to life was almost comforting to Jack. It was familiar, a reminder that they were a family, and nothing would stop them from doing what was right. As they drove toward the front business, Jack's thoughts were with the kids. They had saved Jamal and his sister, but there were more out there, and it was up to them to make sure no other child fell into the same hands. The road ahead was dangerous, but they had no choice but to push forward. Jack's grip tightened on the handlebars, his resolve unshakable. They had come this far, and they weren't going to stop until they had taken down the entire network. They had a mission, and nothing was going to stand in their way. The bikers rode swiftly down the empty roads, the sound of their engines echoing in the quiet night. Jack's mind raced as they approached the front business. They had a solid plan in place, but he couldn't shake the feeling that things were about to escalate quickly. The business in front of them appeared as just another warehouse on the outskirts of town, but Jack knew better. Behind those walls, they would find the heart of the operation, the place where the money was being funneled. As they slowed down to a stop, Jack surveyed the area. The place looked deserted, almost too quiet. There were no signs of life, but the hairs on the back of his neck stood on end. "Stay sharp," Jack muttered to his crew. "We don't know how deep this goes." The bikers dismounted, their boots hitting the ground with a thud. The atmosphere was thick with tension, and Jack could feel his heart pounding. He motioned for Diesel and Bear to move toward the back of the building while he and the others would check the front. Jack knew they couldn't risk alerting anyone inside. They had to move fast and silent. As he approached the front door, Jack's hand hovered over the handle. The moment they entered, all bets were off. They would be going in blind. With a swift motion, Jack pushed open the door, and the sound of it creaking echoed through the empty warehouse. The place smelled like dust and stale air, a long-forgotten relic. But as they moved deeper inside, Jack could sense something wasn't right. The silence was unsettling. The bikers fanned out, moving cautiously through the rows of crates and boxes. The air felt thick, oppressive, and Jack could feel the weight of it pressing down on him. He could tell his crew felt it too. "Keep your eyes peeled," Jack whispered, his voice barely audible. This place could be rigged with cameras or alarms. They moved further in, the only sound their footsteps and the occasional creak of the building settling. Jack's mind kept flashing back to the kids, Jamal and his sister. They had saved them, but there were so many more out there who weren't as lucky. He couldn't let these people continue what they were doing. As they rounded a corner, the group froze. At the far end of the warehouse, Jack spotted movement. Two men, talking in hushed voices, clearly unaware of the bikers' presence. Jack's heart skipped a beat. They had found someone. Without missing a beat, he motioned to his crew. "We take them quietly," he said, his voice firm. The bikers nodded, their expressions hardening with the same resolve that Jack felt. They had been in situations like this before, but now, it felt personal. They weren't just fighting for themselves, they were fighting for the children who had been hurt, for the families torn apart by the people they were about to confront. Jack and Diesel moved first, silently making their way toward the two men. The rest of the crew followed, staying low and quiet. When they were close enough, Jack gave a signal, and the two bikers moved in swiftly, grabbing the men from behind and pinning them to the ground. The element of surprise worked in their favor. The men struggled, but the bikers' strength and speed kept them under control. "Who else is involved?" Jack demanded, his voice cold. The man beneath him glared, but didn't speak. Jack pressed harder. "You're not leaving here until we get answers." After a few seconds, the man finally spoke, his voice shaky. "I don't know what you're talking about," he stammered. "We're just doing what we're told." Jack's grip tightened. "You're lying. Who else is involved in this operation?" The man gulped, fear flickering in his eyes. "I don't know names. I swear. But they're everywhere." Jack's patience was running thin. "Where are they hiding the kids?" he pressed. The man shook his head, but Jack wasn't going to back off. "Tell me, or you're going to regret it." The man's eyes darted to the side, and Jack followed his gaze. In the far corner of the room, he saw a small door that led into another part of the building. It was locked, but Jack had a feeling that whatever was behind that door was what they were looking for. "That's where they keep them," the man muttered. "But you won't get past the guards. You'll be dead before you even reach them." Jack stood up, pulling the man to his feet. "You're going to take us there," Jack said, his voice low and dangerous. The man swallowed hard, nodding reluctantly. "I'll take you, but you'll regret it," he whispered. Jack didn't care. They had come this far, and they were not going to stop now. The rest of the bikers moved toward the door, ready to follow Jack's lead. They were so close now, just a few steps away from bringing this nightmare to an end. As they moved deeper into the warehouse, the silence felt even more oppressive. Every corner could hold a threat, and Jack was prepared for anything. His mind was set. They had a mission, and no one would stop them from finishing it. They had to save those kids, and they would fight until their last breath to do it. The man led them through the dark corridors of the warehouse, his footsteps echoing off the concrete floor. Jack kept his eyes on the back of the man's head, his senses alert. The bikers moved quietly behind him, their boots barely making a sound. Jack could feel the weight of the situation pressing on him. Every second was a risk. They were about to walk into a nest of vipers, and there was no turning back now. The man had promised to take them to where the kids were being kept, but Jack wasn't sure how much longer he could trust him. They reached a small door at the end of the hall, a metal door that looked like it had been there for years, its paint peeling and rusted around the edges. The man stopped in front of it, hesitating for a moment before he turned the handle. "This is it," he muttered, his voice low. Jack nodded. "Open it." The man pushed the door open with a creak, revealing a narrow staircase leading down into the darkness. Jack motioned for Diesel and Bear to take point, and the two bikers moved ahead, their eyes scanning every corner of the room. The air was thick and musty, and the sound of water dripping echoed in the silence. They descended the stairs slowly, the flicker of their flashlights cutting through the gloom. At the bottom of the stairs, Jack could hear faint sounds, whispers, cries, muffled voices. His heart sank. They were close. He could feel it. The man led them to another door at the end of the hallway. This one was heavier, reinforced with steel. Jack reached for the handle, but before he could open it, he heard movement on the other side. His hand froze. Someone was coming. Without a second thought, Jack pulled his gun from his holster and signaled for the others to get ready. The door opened, and a figure stepped through. It was a guard, wearing dark clothes and holding a flashlight. He froze when he saw the bikers, his eyes widening in surprise. "What the hell?" he stammered. Before he could react, Diesel and Bear were on him. They grabbed the guard, pulling him to the ground with a swift, controlled move. Jack stepped forward, his gun still in hand. "Where are the kids?" he demanded. The guard struggled beneath them, but he didn't answer. Jack pressed the barrel of the gun against his cheek. "Tell me, or you'll regret it." The guard hesitated, then muttered, "Down the hall. First door on the left." Jack nodded, his eyes narrowing. "Good. You stay here." He turned to Diesel and Bear. "Let's go." The group moved quickly, their footsteps now louder in the silence. They reached the door the guard had pointed to and stopped. Jack could hear the sounds of children crying from the other side. His stomach churned with anger. This was it. He pushed the door open, his heart racing. Inside, the room was dimly lit, with a few small windows high up on the walls. The children were huddled together, sitting on the cold floor, their faces drawn with fear and exhaustion. Some were crying, others were too scared to make a sound. Jack's heart broke as he scanned the room, his eyes landing on a little girl who was clutching her stuffed animal, tears streaming down her face. He walked in slowly, his voice soft. "Hey, it's okay. You're safe now." The kids looked up, confusion and fear in their eyes. Jack smiled reassuringly. "We're here to get you out of here." He looked back at the bikers. "Get them out now." Diesel and Bear moved into action, helping the kids to their feet, their eyes scanning the room for any more threats. Jack turned to the man who had led them there. "You stay here," he ordered. The man, still on the floor, nodded fearfully. Jack wasn't about to take any chances. He motioned for the bikers to hurry. They needed to get out of there before anyone else showed up. As the kids were escorted out of the room, Jack looked around one last time, making sure they hadn't missed anything. The air was thick with the stench of fear, and the cries of the children echoed in his ears. But they were safe now. They had done it. The bikers led the kids back up the stairs, and Jack followed close behind, his thoughts already moving to the next phase of the operation. They weren't done yet. The men behind this operation would stop at nothing to protect themselves. But Jack wasn't afraid. He would do whatever it took to make sure these kids never had to suffer again. As they exited the building, Jack's mind was set. They had to move fast and strike hard. The authorities would be called in, but Jack knew that they would have to finish the job before the criminals could cover their tracks. The road ahead was dangerous, but they had come this far, and there was no turning back. The bikers rode out of the parking lot, the children safe for now, but Jack's mind was focused on the next step. They were far from finished, and Jack was ready to do whatever it took to make sure the people behind this were brought to justice. As Jack and the bikers rode away from the warehouse, the weight of their mission began to settle in. The kids were safe for now, but there was still much to be done. Jack's mind raced as they cut through the night, heading for the meeting point with the authorities. They had gathered the evidence, found the hidden children, and taken down one of the key locations, but Jack knew that this wasn't the end. The people behind this were ruthless and powerful, and they wouldn't give up without a fight. Jack's phone buzzed in his pocket, pulling him from his thoughts. He reached for it, answering without a second thought. "Jack." The voice on the other end was familiar. Vince. "We've got a problem," Vince said, his voice tight. Jack's stomach tightened. "What's going on?" "The cops, they've already moved in on the warehouse," Vince replied. "They're here." Jack cursed under his breath. They had been counting on getting the jump on the authorities, but it seemed like the criminals were already ahead of them. "Are they with us?" Jack asked, his voice steady but filled with urgency. Vince paused for a moment, then answered, "No, they've been compromised. I think they've been bought off. The second we moved in, they started locking things down." Jack's heart sank. This was exactly what he had feared. The operation was bigger than just the criminals behind the warehouse. The law enforcement was involved, too. Jack clenched his jaw, focusing on the road ahead. "All right, get the kids to safety. We need to regroup. Meet us at the rendezvous point." He hung up, his mind already calculating their next steps. They were dealing with more than just a network of criminals. They were up against a system that had its hands deep in the pockets of those in power. The bikers needed to get ahead of this, and fast. The situation was becoming more complicated by the second. As they reached the rendezvous point, Jack motioned for the bikers to stop. They were parked in a secluded lot, far enough from the eyes of anyone who might be watching. Jack scanned the area, making sure they weren't being followed. They had to act quickly. "All right," Jack said, turning to the group. "We have two options. We can go back in and take down the rest of the operation, or we can try to expose them to the public. But either way, we're going to need help." Diesel stepped forward, his expression hard. "We've already exposed enough. The cops aren't going to help us, Jack. We need to finish this ourselves." Jack nodded. He knew Diesel was right, but the stakes were higher than ever. They couldn't afford to mess this up. "Agreed. But we need to get in and out fast. No more surprises." The bikers didn't need any more encouragement. They were ready. As they rode out, Jack's mind was focused on the task at hand. The kids had been saved, but now the real battle was about to begin. They were going to take down the entire network, and nothing was going to stop them. As they approached the next target, Jack could see the shadows of figures moving in the distance. The warehouse had been just the beginning. There were more people, more locations, and more children who needed their help. The night was dark, but Jack could feel the fire in his chest, the same fire that had kept him going all these years. The Thunder Riders had always been a family, and together, they would see this through to the end. "We're going in," Jack said, his voice cold with determination. The bikers revved their engines, their bikes roaring to life as they prepared to hit their next target. They would bring this down, no matter the cost. And as the engines roared into the night, Jack knew that this was just the beginning of the fight. The road ahead would be dangerous, but with the Thunder Riders by his side, nothing would stand in their way. The night was colder. Now, the wind biting through the trees as Jack and the Thunder Riders made their final push toward the heart of the operation. They had tracked down the remaining members of the criminal network, the ones who had been hiding in the shadows, pulling the strings. They had gathered all the evidence they needed, and now it was time to end this once and for all. The bikers moved in silence, their engines low and steady as they approached the last target. Jack's mind was focused, his hands steady on the handlebars. They had already rescued the children, but the war wasn't over. The people they were up against were ruthless, and they would stop at nothing to protect their empire. As they neared the compound, Jack signaled for the group to slow down. They needed to be careful. The compound was heavily guarded, and one wrong move could blow their cover. They didn't have the luxury of making mistakes. "Stay sharp," Jack muttered, his voice low but filled with authority. "We move in fast, hit them hard, and get out." The bikers nodded, their faces hard with determination. They had all made sacrifices to get here, and they weren't going to let anyone stand in their way now. The compound loomed ahead, its high walls and barbed wire fence a stark reminder of the danger that lay inside. Jack's heart pounded in his chest. This was it. He had made a promise to the kids they had saved, to the families who had been torn apart by these criminals. And now, it was time to make good on that promise. Jack's thoughts were interrupted by a flash of movement. A guard had spotted them. He shouted a warning, and before Jack could react, the compound erupted into chaos. Gunshots rang out in the night, and the bikers returned fire, their weapons quick and precise. The guards were no match for them. Jack and his crew had been through worse, and they weren't about to back down now. They pushed forward, their boots pounding against the ground as they advanced on the compound. Jack's mind was clear as he led the charge, his focus on the mission ahead. They had to take down the men behind this, the ones who had orchestrated the trafficking, the ones who had exploited innocent children. They had to stop them before they could hurt anyone else. The bikers fought their way through the compound, each one moving with a deadly precision that only years of experience could provide. Jack moved through the chaos, his eyes scanning every corner, every shadow. He knew that the leader of the operation was inside. He had to be. Jack could feel the adrenaline pumping through his veins as they reached the heart of the compound. The leader was waiting for them. Jack could feel it in his gut. The man was surrounded by his henchmen, but Jack wasn't afraid. This was the moment they had all been waiting for. They reached the central building, a large, imposing structure that seemed to be the nerve center of the operation. Jack kicked the door open, his gun drawn and ready. Inside, the leader was sitting at a desk, calm and collected, as if he had known they were coming. His eyes narrowed when he saw Jack. "You should have stayed out of this," the man said, his voice cold. "You've cost me everything." Jack stepped forward, his voice low but filled with anger. "You're done," he said, his words final. The man stood up slowly, his hands raised in mock surrender. "You think you've won?" he said, a cruel smile curling on his lips. "This isn't over. There's always someone else willing to take my place." Jack's finger tightened on the trigger. "Not this time," he said. In a flash, the man reached for a gun on the desk, but Jack was faster. He fired once, the shot echoing through the room. The man dropped to the floor, his eyes wide with disbelief. Jack didn't flinch. He had made his choice. This was the end of the line for the criminals who had caused so much pain. As the bikers secured the compound and ensured the safety of the remaining children, Jack took a deep breath. The battle was over. They had done what they came to do. The children were safe, the criminals were defeated, and justice had been served. Jack looked around at his crew, his family, the people who had stood by him through it all. "We did it," he said, his voice filled with a quiet pride. Diesel nodded, his face hard but satisfied. "We did." Jack's eyes shifted to the horizon, the early morning light beginning to break through the darkness. It was over. The mission was complete, but Jack knew the fight for justice would never truly end. He would always be there to protect those who couldn't protect themselves. The Thunder Riders had finished this chapter, but there would always be more battles to fight, more wrongs to right. And as long as he had his brothers by his side, Jack knew they would never stop fighting for what was right.